So I'd like to continue our lecture series here on T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets and begin a discussion of the method of inquiry, specifically that Eliot uses thinking with language, and that language itself in Eliot's poems moves differently than a crafted architecture, that the Four Quartets themselves as a turn of Eliot's is a profound turn toward ontological and existential authenticity, and that the quartets themselves are Eliot's attempt, an explorative attempt through language, as he says, trying to use words, and every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure, because one has only learnt to get the better of words. For the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning. And my point of movement upon which the entire quartet turns is for in the ending is my beginning. And Eliot's exploration, as we've discussed, and I'll state it here just to pull up the poem, "In my beginning is my end." As we've discussed with Trackle, and we've moved through Herderlin as well, the Eliot's expanse, which is a continually iterative process through the wasteland and through the hollow men, it is an expanse which Eliot refuses to calm. And in this refusal to calm, what we are allowed to experience is the path toward the ontos, the way that Eliot weaves through the garden, through history, through time, this descent that Eliot undertakes into the darkness. Descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude. World not world, but that which is not world. Internal darkness, deprivation, and destitution of all property. Evacuation, inoperancy. This is the one way. The other is the same, not in movement, but abstention from movement. Eliot seeks to take us into the buried day, much as Trackle does, and this is the great similarity that they share, is that Eliot's path is a weaving which is allowed in the poem itself being utterly irrelevant. That, as it is explicitly stated in a self-conscious way through the quartets, that the poem itself is the way through toward the ontos, and that the ontos emerges, as with Trackle, through this sophistication of the innocent pursuit of poetic language. As Eliot states in the quartets, 20 years of this pursuit and the attempt, which finally breaks Eliot open into this communion at which he stands upon, "In my end is my beginning," in which he stands upon a poetic innocence, and we watch Eliot's language break in the poem, and this is what's so crucial, is that we get the true inquiry of the poet toward the ontos, which is the possibility of disclosure. This possibility opens in Eliot, and it opens through his pursuit, as we've discussed again with Shelley, the pursuit of the Renaissance mind. As we understand, Eliot is extremely well versed in ancient history and ancient philosophy, especially ancient Hindu philosophy. This pursuit is Eliot's working of the poem down to the bone, down to the ontological bone of existence, into deeper communion, in which the poem ultimately collapses into the clanging of the bell as the ground swell that is and was from the beginning, where time stops and time is never ending. This is Eliot falling into the music of poetry, the coming about of being through the poem, and he must descend through his own linguistic markers. So we have the references to Krishna. The poems themselves, the quartets, are stations, historical stations, material stations, which Eliot visits and knows, and he descends through history. He descends through the body of the earth, which becomes the body of the poem, into the possibility of the powers. And this is where it gets extremely explicit at the very end of the quartets. Driven by demonic, Chthonic powers, right action is freedom from past and future. Also, the life of significant soil. Here are the past and future, conquered, reconciled. Here the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. And the poem itself is the space for this possibility. And this is what we understand in Herderlin, what we understand in Trackle, is that the poem is a clearing, it is an opening into this ontological possibility of the union of that which is not, but is fundamentally, in a way that is quite ineffable, as Eliot states explicitly in the quartets, that the possibility of approaching this ineffable condition emerges through the work of the poem and the working of the poem. And this is where, with Eliot, we receive something that is revolutionary, in that it is a authentic confrontation with the act and the working of language, which is unremoved. That the process of thought in and through which Eliot descends, wherein we open in the Rose Garden, that he must descend into the unheard music hidden in the shrubbery and the unseen eye-beam crossed, as he looks down into the drained pool. To find what humankind cannot bear, which is very much reality. And we see and we hear and we are allowed to bear the kinks and the bumps and the worn and the unsmoothed nature of Eliot's high process. You're given in Eliot throughout his career, and perhaps in no greater moment than in the four quartets, access to the raw, unfiltered process of thinking through language, which itself does not privilege any one mode of ontological revelation. Everything from Campton and Putney to descending lower into the world which is not world. There's the philosophical thought, the historical thought, and the musical thought, which themselves, in the advanced state of Eliot's working with language, the smithing of language, which we would call the poetic practice. In this advanced state, these different thought modes are no longer privileged, but instead are intercoursing to give way or gain way to the ontos, to gain way into the revelation and disclosure of being. This is a profound state of vulnerability in which Eliot's thought itself, again, thinking through language, is descending into a translucence, in that the thought itself is stripping itself of narrative identity, stripping itself of self, and stripping itself of self-awareness and self-consciousness, as we see in Eliot's attempt to find the possibility of the opening of poetry in his language, as the poem itself descends at the still point and toward the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is. That Eliot attempts to find this mode of consciousness is specifically and continually grounded in and through landedness. History, the Rose Garden, Highgate, Primrose, And even still, this attempt to ground, after the kingfisher's wing, ground that there is world not world. That there is a profound darkness and stillness towards which can music or words reach, as a Chinese jar still moves perpetually in its stillness, nor stillness of the violin. Eliot's poetry is fundamentally a poetry of reckoning with the silence and stillness of the point upon which all movement turns and ends. Love itself is unmoving, only the cause and end of movement. Timeless and undesiring, except in the aspect of time caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Sudden in a shaft of sunlight, even while the dust moves, there rises the hidden laughter of children in the foliage. Quick now, here now, always. Ridiculous, the waste sad time stretching before and after. So this is a state of consciousness. It's a state of perception, a way of being in the world and a way of being in time, which itself is the poetic mode of the opening of the possibility of disclosure through the innocent act of poetry. As we know, Eliot was a banker and lived we could say, a relatively normal human life. And the practice of poetry, in Eliot's terms, is to open up the possibility of this field by descending through his linguistic and languaging practice to speak being out into the open field. On a summer midnight, you can hear the music. Eliot's attempt to open this field and the vulnerability and accessibility. And when I say accessibility, I don't mean that the language itself is easy or the process of following the languaging is easy, but that the language itself makes accessible the path toward being, which Eliot undertakes in the four quartets. That he must think his way through, which is to say a descent down into the ontological opening and the possibility of the approach. And in doing so, Eliot is not only evoking time and space, history and place, but through time and space, history and place, descending down into the wisdom. The houses are all gone under the sea. The dancers are all gone under the hill. Dark, dark, dark. They go into the dark, the vacant interstellar spaces, the vacant into the vacant, the captains, merchant, bankers, eminent men of letters. This is the loss of space and time and the descent of the soul into this fundamental obeying darkness, which he says, which shall be the darkness of God. As in a theater, the lights are extinguished for the scene to be changed. So Eliot's descent is a descent into transformation and the transformative state, wherein he says to his soul, be still and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. This is a vacation, a vacancy, which Eliot is making and holing out into the self, into perception, and into the seeming light of being, to allow for poetry to enter. This is the clearing of the vessel or the channel of the poet to receive the song of being or the sound of being or the sight of being. This is precisely what is meant by poetry as being a clearing. 20 years largely wasted trying to use words, and every attempt is a wholly new start. What this process is a process of vacation, with shabby equipment always deteriorating and the general mess of imprecision of feeling. What Eliot is articulating is that as we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living. This is actually the possibility of the richness of disclosure availing itself through the degradation. of Eliot's poetic practice, that there has been a symbolic richness of Eliot's study and participation in the innocent practice of poetry, in which he has been pursuing the availment of being, or the space of the clearing in which being can emerge through the poetic act. But it is precisely in the degradation of time and the amassing of failure, which is to say the bodies of the poems, which have arrived in different kinds of failures, that it has broken open Eliot's practice, which is the four quartets, into a vulnerability and innocence as in a state of being and a way of being in time, which is an openness and availability of perception, toward and through which the symbolic mode of Eliot's linguistic practice, all of his knowledge, all of his study, are discharged in a way in which there is no significant status being availed to any of this material. It is being discharged toward the sole purpose of authentic unveiling of being. And that thus the poem itself and the linguistic act have no meaning, that they themselves are the attempt and the attempt alone to articulate the inarticulatable. And this is why the theme of renunciation and enunciation are so profound in the four quartets. That Eliot himself has opened up enough ontological space in the clearing of his perception to witness the failing powers at hand. And this is his predecessors, which are the hollow men and the wasteland, that enough of this degradation has become available to Eliot's thought, which has itself, as he states explicitly, it is a modesty of thought and a trying of thought. There is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again. That this is a profound opening in the possibility of Eliot's thought, which then makes this disclosure of being available to a degree which I believe quite clearly in Shelley's oeuvre, or in Eliot's oeuvre, is exceptional and itself his masterwork. This is the wisening or the wisdom of Eliot's practice. That time is no healer, the patient is no longer here. You are not the same people who left that station or who will arrive at any terminus. And this is Eliot's thinking toward the same state that Trackle is thinking toward, which is the clearing of being in the transformative state of which that which was no longer is, and something of the grieving and the melancholic in the contemplating of this action, which occurs in time, and the time of death is every moment. So this contemplation of death, which is, of course, the ancient and transhistorical philosophical practice, as it enters into and becomes available in the languaging of the poet, or the thinking of the poet, the dark throat which will not reject them, or wherever cannot reach them the sound of the sea's bells. Perpetual Angelus. That all of language, all of the sedimentary history of Eliot's language and languaging practice, as one of the great modernists, one of the most well-versed modernists, both theologically and philosophically and historically, that all of this language must become available to be broken and rent in this process and practice to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death and love, ardor and selflessness and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. This is the exceptional rendering of Eliot's thought, which collapses under the necessity of the revelation of the ontos and makes available the total vulnerability of poetic thought, which is to stand in the clearing as being itself. And this availability comes through, precisely as we've discussed in a historical sense, the cultivation of this profound aesthetic, symbolic, poetic practice, which is then collapsed. That the collapse of Eliot's practice in his late works, especially the four quartets, is a collapse into the necessity of innocence, which Hölderlin articulates and Heidegger later picks up on. And that without the assembly in and through historical time of not only the lived experience of Eliot, which of course these quartets are grounded in literal spaces in time, which Eliot experiences, but the practice of this poetic act of clearing create as a fermentation in the body and the life of the poet the possibility of a disclosure event such as the four quartets, in which and through which the meaning of being becomes apparent. And as Eliot is so concerned with Krishna, the face of being itself becomes apparent where otherwise it is veiled, where otherwise there are the trees and the hills, the distant panorama, the bold, imposing facade, all being rolled away. And we see this in Eliot's listing of the Stock Exchange Gazette, Directory of Directors, the sun and moon, nobody's funeral, for there is no one to bury. I said to my soul, be still, and let the dark come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God. This is the breaking of the phenomenological space of experience, which is the cultivated perception and the ontological position of the poet in the loss of distance between the poet and being itself. That the poet, rather, is not apart from being and observing and remarking upon it, but absolutely absorbed into being. And this is the danger which we've discussed and I will discuss again, that Hölderlin articulates. That it is the danger of the closure of space, which is the presence of this realization, that the realization of being, or the field of being, is opened. And in as such, the poet's identification with it is simultaneously a profound descent from that which is appearing to be life in the phenomenological world down into this timeless dimension, this world of perpetual solitude, world not world. And this is Eliot's practice, which is framed explicitly as a theological practice, as a practice which is saintly. And this is an essential observation on behalf of Eliot, that this practice of poetry is a saintly practice. And Heidegger observes this as well in Hölderlin, and that it is, first and foremost, that as legislators of the world, the poetic practice is a saintly practice of descent into the ontological foundations of being, that which is beyond and before appearance, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. Through the first gate into our first world shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world. There they were, dignified and visible, moving without pressure over the dead leaves. This is Eliot giving us his moment of Dante and Virgil at the threshold or the gates of hell, giving us this movement through the vibrant air that he is examining and looking at the roses in this garden, looking down into the drained pool. And that we have a series of firmly grounded observations of experience. The circulation of the lymph, the drift of stars, summer in the tree. We move above the moving tree in light upon the figured leaf. And this historical and material presence of space and body is itself the accessibility and the accession of what Eliot comes to, which is the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless. A white light still and moving. And this attempt therein to articulate this essential, ineffable state of being and perception. And this is the something of a classic poetic move. And it's not so much a structural or syntactical move as it is a move of perception. That the mode of being in poetry or poetically dwelling is a descent into this veiled state, beyond the veil of phenomenon, into the essential, into the foundational. And the gift of Eliot's poetry, which perhaps we'll go even deeper into at some point, is that we're given his thought, and his thought which is no longer concerned with poetry or the poem in terms of architecture or aesthetic structure, that we are given his thought in a vulnerability, in a penitence, in a renunciation, which is the languaging brought to bear, unbroken, toward this process of unveiling. In that the process itself of unveiling is the sacred. It is the sacred poetic act. That to only leave the moments of the presence of ontos would be to betray the poetic task, or the task of returning to this place of dwelling poetically. The music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. So this movement, which is a structural movement of vulnerability, which is in large part Eliot's trajectory as a poet. This movement of vulnerability is what makes Eliot so unique in the at-large poetic history, that it is not requiring a perfection of disclosure of being, but rather it is a process of disclosure of being through descent down into dwelling poetically. And this is the cycle of the four quartets. And that not only is this a process which is being depicted, as in the descent through the rose garden, and the descent through history, and the historical markers, which are Eliot's four stations, but that it is itself the process of Eliot making himself available to being. The process of entering into the ontological mode of disclosure, which is the poetic state, drawing himself down from the everyday into this state of availability, which is a state of perception which is being cultivated, which is the richness of which the poem is detritus or cast off. And this is the practice which, as Eliot states, is saintly, because it is a communion with being. that even as he observes the frigid purgatorial fires, the dripping blood as our only drink, the bloody flesh as our only food. And again, this deeply Christian literature, that it is the state which is cultivated, which is the mature state, again, as he says, 20 years of languaging failures, the mature state of entering into this field of perception, which is itself the gift or the riches, the Pluton of Eliot's work. The gift and the riches of the four quartets, which are themselves far richer than any worldly thing. Because they themselves are the authentic disclosure. And they give us the possibility of disclosure and the path through disclosure in the languaging of the mature poet. So, thank you.